Hey guys, you're watching Dansky, the place to be to develop your creative skills, and in this tutorial we're going to take a look at 8 different techniques that you can use in Photoshop to enhance your creative composites. Okay, so a little while ago I bought a rather fancy camera lens and I haven't actually tried it out yet. So when MSI asked if I wanted to check out their new beast of a laptop and make some videos together, I was like, hell yeah. And then using the aforementioned camera lens, I made this. So, this is MSI's Creator 17 laptop, and as you just saw, the specs are rather insane. And the standout feature for this particular laptop is the mini LED display, which means it's both incredibly bright, but it also achieves a level of color accuracy that we need as creative professionals. And this is what I'm going to be using for this tutorial. So Mac users, you know I love you, but this tutorial is on Windows. So as I mentioned, we're going to be compositing some images in Photoshop, but also going over 8 of my favorite techniques that I use all the time in my own creative work. The last one is my absolute favorite, but you'll have to stick around until the end of the video to find out exactly what it is. Haha! So without further ado, let's get started. Rightio, so we're now in Photoshop and you can see I have an image of some rather colourful city streets. I also have my subject here. She will be the focal point of this composition, and I want to start with a soft blur here, and then as we move into the distance, the image in the background to become more blurred. So what I'm going to do is just turn this off here, right click on my scene or background image and select Convert to Smart Object. This allows me to go up here and apply smart filters. Smart filters can be edited or removed, otherwise the effects up here will be permanent. So from the blur gallery, let's go and click Tilt Shift. And we're presented with this window. We get one blur point created by default, and you can see we can move this around. Now this is one of Photoshop's GPU accelerated features, so if you do have a beefy computer with something like an RTX card in there, you're going to get a lot more performance out of this feature. However, if you are on older hardware, what you can do is go up to Preview, uncheck this, make all your blur adjustments here, and then check that on just to check it's all correct, and then click OK. Otherwise, every single change you do will be rendered, and it can be pretty demanding on the old hardware. So next what I'm going to do is just crank up the blur. I can adjust this after, it just helps me to see where my blur is, and what I'm going to do is just move this lower towards the bottom. Now the space in between the two solid lines will have no blur applied. Anything that extends beyond the dashed line, so this space up here, will have no additional blur applied to it, and the maximum is 34. That's what we've set over here on the right. Now the space in between the dashed line and the solid line, that's this space here, will graduate from no blur up to the blur that you've set on the right hand side, which in this case is 34 pixels. So that's going to be our graduation. Think of this as a gradient blur. And if I bring this close, you can see that transition from no blur to all the blur happens very quickly, too quickly in fact. So I'm going to extend this up and you can see it's much more gradual. It's also applied to both sides, but we only need one side. So I'm just going to move this down to the bottom and I'm going to set the start point for my blur somewhere around here. And then I'll have it end somewhere like this. Now, because we have the road here, but we also have buildings going in the distance on either side, we're going to need to add 2 more blur points. So I'm going to go over to the left and click here, hover over one of the 2 white nodes and rotate. And I can hold Shift to snap this to 90 degrees, adjust the start point of my blur, and then I'm going to drag this out to the edge of these buildings. I'm going to go over here and repeat the process. So hold Shift and rotate, and then drag that endpoint all the way to the edge. And as I mentioned, this blur is pretty extreme, so we could go up. That looks ridiculous, so we're going to bring it down. We'll hover around. Let's go for 15 pixels. And if you're feeling cheeky, you can even turn on high quality. Let's click OK. And there you go. You can see this is listed as a smart filter down here. We can turn this off. and back on again. We can edit it by double clicking it or just drag it to the trash to remove it. Now the only other thing we need to do is add a little bit more blur here, because you can see this is all really sharp and in focus, and then this is much more out of focus. So this is one little trick I like to do. Just go up to Filter, onto Blur, and select Gaussian Blur. This will be listed as another smart filter, and just something really subtle, somewhere between 1 and say 4. So maybe we go for 2, turn this off and back on, and you can see that it just makes that transition from blur to much more blur a little bit smoother. And if I turn on my subject, I want my subject to be the focal point of this image anyway. So if I turn off both of these smart filters, this is where we started, and this is where we ended up. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at cutting out our subject. So I have this one done already. Here's one I made earlier, and I'm going to press Command or Control J on the keyboard a couple of times just to duplicate that and save the one that I spent 20 to 30 minutes on down there. Now there's two different ways to do this. Actually, that's a lie. There are millions of different ways to cut out a subject, but I'm going to show you the two that I used most often for my creative work. That's going to be the quick and lazy method and the slower and patient method. So we'll call this lazy. We'll do this one first, and then we'll call this one patient. So if we disable this one, we'll start with the lazy one. Let's get rid of those masks. So this is the original image, and this render has a plain background. So this technique can be quite useful. If you do have a more complex background, then maybe the patient method is going to be a little bit more effective. So let's go up here and we'll go select, subject, and you can see it does a pretty good job. As I say, your results may vary depending on your image. However, if we mask this right now, the edge will be a little bit hard. So I'm just going to zoom in. You can see where the selection is there. Let's go to select, modify, and contract. Now this setting here depends on the size of your image, but I'm going to go with 1 pixel, and you'll see the selection just creeps in a little bit more. And then I go to select, modify, and I'm going to feather this as well. We'll go with 1 pixel again. Feathering just softens the edge, and then when I go and apply my layer mask, you can see it's a little bit softer around the edge. And a little trick you can use just to make it easier to see and refine your selection is by going to the adjustment icon, clicking solid color. We'll pick a nice bold contrasting color like bright red, and I'll just drag this underneath my subject. And that just makes it a little bit easier to refine the cutout of your subject or your object. And then when you're happy, you can just switch this layer off or delete it altogether. So that is the quick and lazy method. Now we're going to look at the slow and patient method. So let's click on this layer up here. Straight away, we're going to add our layer mask. We're going to grab the brush tool, and let's go and pick one of Photoshop's default brushes. Now we don't really want to use a hard brush because again, we're going to get that hard edge. Wow, that brush is way too big. So you can adjust the size of your brush using the left and right square brackets on the keyboard. So a hard brush is just going to give a really hard edge to the cutout. That's something that I like to avoid personally, because otherwise it just looks a little bit unnatural. And I think it looks more authentic when you have a slightly softer edge around the edge of your subject or your object, rather than a perfectly crisp cutout. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to grab the soft round pressure opacity brush. You can see we've got a bit of feathering on there. The hardness is 0. You can bring this up a pinch if you want. And I'm just going to zoom in nice and close. And you can do this with a graphics tablet, which is a little bit easier. In fact, if you are using a tablet, what I would recommend is going up to Window down to Brush Settings, switch on Shape Dynamics, and then use Pen Pressure. So the size of your brush will be dependent on the pressure you apply to the tablet. However, we all have access to a mouse or a trackpad, so I'm going to do this with a mouse. And you can start brushing in here. Let's just close this panel down. And that's probably a little bit too big, so I'm going to bring that brush size down and just brush along here. And I can turn my bright red layer back on again. And I'm just going to do this very quickly. So you can see that bright colored layer makes it much easier for me to see exactly where I am, how my cutout is looking, if I've missed anything. And it's always better just to cut into the image a little bit if you can't get it exactly on the line, just so you don't get some little halo effect from the background showing through. And you can do this even smaller if you would like a slightly harder edge. So you can use the size of your brush to determine that, or you can adjust the brush hardness. Now you do this all the way around, and then what you need to do is just make that brush a bit bigger and do these areas out here. And then once you've done that, make it really big and do this area over here. You could probably call this the wasteland, just all that excess space. So this technique is much more useful if you have, let's say, a slightly busier background, or you're finding it harder to make a selection in Photoshop. However, if you are thinking about cutting out hair, this hair here isn't too difficult, but cutting out hair is an entirely different beast, and I've done a few tutorials on that in the past. But this soft brush cutting out technique around the edge, that is really useful for most parts of the image, and cutting out the entire subject here took me around 20 to 30 minutes in total. So if I delete both of these layers here and our colorful layer, you can have a look at this version. This took me, as I say, about 20 to 30 minutes. And I did a pretty quick job on the hair there, but all the way around the edge. You can see here what I mean. If you don't cut into it enough, you get that little kind of halo around the edges. But this was all done using the brush tool. And if you do have a slightly more complicated background, or you just want to have a bit more control over your cutout, this is a technique that you can use. Okay, so next we're going to take a look at Liquify. Now this is another GPU accelerated feature, so powerful hardware is going to be your friend here. So we'll start by holding Shift and selecting both of these layers. You may have more layers, select everything, right click, convert to Smart Object. And this is all grouped into one layer, but don't worry, if you want to make any changes, you can double click on the thumbnail and you can see everything is preserved here. You can make any changes you like, and then click the cross up here to close this down. Make sure you click yes to save any changes, and it will take you back to the original document. Think of this as the ability to save documents within documents within documents. And because this is a smart object, we can go up to Filter and down to Liquify. And it loads this window here. Let's just blow this up. Now we've got a few different tools in here. We can have a lot of fun with this. We'll start with Warp. You can adjust the brush size, again using the left and right square brackets, and you can do just that. You can warp the image in quite weird and wonderful ways, or you can do something like this, a bit of paint marbling. We'll undo that because that was terrible. However, you can use warp to very cleverly shape parts of your image. It might be the image, an object in the scene, it might be your subject. So I could just shape part of the forearm here. We'll zoom in a little bit more. Now on the render here, I kind of messed up the shoulder a little bit, so I'm just going to zoom in and just correct some of this, just reshape that shoulder. And you can zoom in much closer and spend much longer doing this, and adjusting that brush size really helps give you a little bit more control. So there we go, something like this. This part of the shoulder's a bit sharp. I'm just going to flatten that down. We could even grab the hair and just give that a little bit of a curve. So I'm just adjusting that brush size, trying to smooth things out a little bit. Now you can see I am affecting the background as well. So what you could do is apply Liquify on a different layer rather than the entire image. But if you take a bit more time and care, you can actually do this without disturbing the background pretty well. And this is a very simple use of Liquify, but you can use it to completely change an image. It just depends on how you're using it. Some other uses of Liquify are the Reconstruct tool. So if I go and liquify something like this, that looks terrible. We can go over to Reconstruct, brush over it, and it does just that. Brings back the original image. We've also got Pucker and Bloat, which are pretty useful. So Pucker kind of sucks in towards the center, so let's do that here. There we go, tiny face. And Bloat does the opposite. It pushes out from the center, like so. So a more practical use might be, she goes to the gym quite a lot. And what we're gonna do is we're just gonna beef up those biceps and those shoulders there. Maybe a little bit down here. There we go. No, Dan, let's undo that. Come on, stay focused. So there we go. I can actually uncheck preview and you can see those few changes that we've made. Now over here on the right, we also have something called Face Aware Liquify. Now this is powered by AI. And what we can do is we can select a face in our scene. So it's detected we have at least one face. I'm just going to zoom in. Now we can't really see the eyes. However, the nose and the mouth is visible. And we can adjust some of these properties. So the nose height, the nose width, even though we're on an angle, it's still being able to do this and affect the image around it. We can add a little cheeky smile there. Now you can go to the absolute extreme and this often just looks ridiculous, but I use this quite a lot just to add a little bit of a smile or a little bit of sincerity to someone's expression. It doesn't need too much. You can go and adjust all these different parameters and there's a lot of fun to be had here, as you can see. However, I often find that just a little bit is enough just to change that expression. Something like this. Let's preview it. There we go. When you're happy, click OK, and you can see this is now listed as a smart filter. And again, we can turn this off and back on. Right, next we're going to take a look at color balance and levels. So let's double click on the thumbnail to go back inside our smart object, and we can go to the bottom of the layers panel. Click on the adjustment icon and we're going to select color balance. Now, color balance is incredibly useful for adjusting the colors of the shadows, midtones, and highlights in a particular image. And one of the challenges when compositing images is that they're often shot under different lighting conditions. So the subject here is a little bit warmer, much brighter on this side, darker along her back on the left. And the image in the background has been shot at night. We've got lots of pinks, reds, blues. So they're completely different tonally in terms of color. So what we need to do is use color balance to try and match these colors together more effectively. So what I'm going to do is start with the shadows. And before we go any further, we need this color balance adjustment layer to only affect our subject. So we'll right click on this here, go to create clipping mask, and you can see this arrow is pointing to the layer below, so it's only affecting our subject. And you've also got that same option down here. So with the shadows selected, let's go and start tinkering with the color. Now this might be a little bit daunting at first, but don't worry, if you're not sure, you could just adjust the sliders for the shadows, midtones, and highlights, and then visually see in real time how it's looking. So just give these a tinker until you get something you like. So we're going to add in some more magenta, lean towards the blue a bit more, and then we'll jump on to the highlights. Something like this. Now the beauty of this is that it is an adjustment layer, so I can always turn it off, turn it back on, or just double click on the thumbnail icon here to go back and make changes. Now that's a pretty good start. What I'm going to do now is go down to the adjustment icon again and add a levels adjustment layer. We'll make this a clipping mask, so this is also applied to our subject, and just bring up those blacks a little bit. Our shadow at the moment down here is far too dark, and you can see over here we have a shadow on a signpost, and this is much, much darker, so we need to try and match the shadows together. So I'm just going to bring those up a little bit. Not too much, something very subtle. And then we'll change the channel to blue. Bring this up a pinch here. Very, very subtle. And then maybe just a dash of green as well. We'll just bring that up. Nothing too crazy. Maybe jump back to RGB and just, there we go. And now we can preview this by clicking on the eye here. So it's subtle, but you can see the difference. So there we go, that is our subject. Now we're going to do the same. We're going to click on our scene, and we could go down here and we could add an adjustment layer. Or what we can do, because this is a smart object, we can go up to image, down to adjustments, and select color balance here. I guess this is a smart adjustment layer, and you can see it becomes listed underneath. Slightly different interface here, but the same thing. So we can go and adjust the shadows, There we go. So we're just going to try and match these together. I'll do this super quickly. You can, of course, spend much longer on yours. There we go. Okay, fantastic. And we can turn this off and back on just to see how it looks. So there you go. You can see there's now a lot more synergy between the colors in our subject and our background. And what we can do now is go and close this down. We'll be asked if we want to save the changes. Click yes. And it keeps this all contained within that smart object here. And I'm just going to give this a name. We'll call this final. And you will need to save your main document for all of those changes to be saved. So let's save that now. And there we go. Rightio, this next one is nice and quick. So let's select our layer, go down to the adjustments icon, and we're going to select color lookup. Now this uses LUTs. LUT stands for lookup table, and essentially you can think of these as a color profile. You find this often in video, and we can apply these here as well. Now you can load your own 3D LUT if you do have one, but if you don't worry, there's plenty of presets here. Now we've got futuristic bleak that I quite like. It strips out a lot of the color and the life from the image. That's a bit bleak in itself actually. And I like horror blue as well. I'm seeing a bit of a pattern here. Bleak and horror. Now another one that is also really good is moonlight or night from day. Both very similar, essentially enable you to take a daytime scene and make it nighttime. Now, of course, you will need to do some more work on this for it to actually look like nighttime, but this LUT does give you a good head start. So I'll go up here and I'll just show you a few more. We've got drop blues. You can see you can get some really cool effects. You can actually apply multiple color lookup adjustment layers, combine them together and get super creative. I think I'm going to stick with horror blue. This is a bit overpowering though, so I'm just going to bring this down up here. That's the opacity. We'll probably go for around about 50%. There we go. That looks good to me. And there is a look at the color lookup adjustment layer. Okay, so this next one is very dear to me. This is one of the first things that I learned in Photoshop, and that is brushes. Now, you can find brushes online everywhere. There are millions, probably billions nowadays of free brushes out there. So you can use free ones, paid ones, or the ones that come with Photoshop. Regardless, let's go and create a new layer. Now I'm going to bring this underneath my color lookup layer, just so any color filters that I've got here affect the brush effects that I'm about to apply. So let's grab that brush tool. We'll make sure that white is the foreground color. There we go. Or you can pick a different color if you like. And we'll go to the brush drop down and you can see I've got some here. These ones are from Envato Elements. I'll link them down in the video description if you'd like to check them out. There's lots of different options. The reason I like these is because you can do this. There you go. 1 click, snow. 2 clicks, more snow. Now you can use actual images of snow and lighting effects, and you can blend those images using the blending options, but sometimes using brushes just gives you much more control. So I can adjust the size of this, bring this down, and then I could start placing snow exactly where I want. I can go up here, I could grab a different snow brush, and so I can use this to start to build my scene out. That looks awful, that's far too intense. So with brushes, it gives you a bit more control over the creative aspect. I'm just going to click here and add some snow. There we go. Nice and simple. I'll call this layer snow. And we're going to add a couple more layers as well. So I'm going to add some fog to this next one. And then I'm going to add a spotlight to this one here. So we'll start with the fog. Let's go down. I love a good bit of fog. I use fog all the time in my work. So I'm just going to pick this one here. Click, there we go, fog. Now, if I just zoom out, you can actually see the edge of the brush a bit clearer. So you could use multiple fog brushes, for example, in combination with each other. We can bring the size down, and I'm just going to click, and there we go. We've added some fog to that bottom corner. And then I could bring the opacity down if I wanted. If you want to change the color of a brush you've already added, what you could do is right click, do the blending options, go to color overlay and pick a color, or you can go up to image, down to adjustments, select hue and saturation, check colorize, and then adjust the color here, and just bring that lightness up or down. There we go, down a little bit, and you can adjust the color that way. So maybe I want something that's a little bit blue, so it fits in more with the image. I might just bring that up a pinch. There we go. So we've added some fog. Now, lastly, we're going to add a spotlight, because you can see my subject is clearly being lit from the upper right corner here. So let's select the brush tool and go and grab a spotlight brush. We'll just pick this one here, zoom out so I can see the brush itself. Now I want to angle this something like 45 degrees. So I'm just going to grab this triangular point on the edge, rotate this, click, boom, there we go, lighting. If you do muck it up, you can just go to edit and undo. There's the shortcut as well, Command or Control Z. And I might make this a pinch bigger. There we go. Or you could just brush this in, something really subtle, keeping it out the edge of the canvas. And there we go. So that's a few quick brush effects. You can of course take a lot longer with your design, and there are many brushes out there. So yeah, go crazy and have fun. But what I'm going to do now is just select all of these holding shift and just group them together. And we'll just call this brush effects. Now what you can also do with brush effects is you can adjust the blending mode, and you can see now in real time how all this changes. But I think I'll just leave mine with pass through for now. So if I turn it off, that's where we were. Back on, this is where we've ended up. 16 years on, and brushes are still one of my favorite things to play around with. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is really subtle, but something that I use in most of my creative work. So if we select everything by holding shift, and again, we're going to create another smart object. There we go, we've got smart object inception going on here. We'll go and give this a name. We'll call it Final. There we go, seems suitable. What we can do is go up here to filter and down to camera raw filter. Now you can actually play around with all of these, and you've got a lot of control over here, how this can affect your image. However, we're going to go to effects and focus on this one here, grain, or I'm thinking of this as noise, adding noise to the image. Now, before we tinker with this, let's go down here to this icon that looks like a Y, and we get a before and after view. So let's just zoom in here. I'm holding Command or Control plus or minus to zoom in, and you can hold down the space bar to get the hand and then click and drag. So you can see I can move this around. Oh, that looks so smooth. Oh, delicious. Right, so you can see the before and after. If I introduce some of the grain, there we go. So this looks a little bit too clean, and if you're like me and you're using 3D objects or 3D characters in your work and you want a bit more photorealism, sometimes those 3D objects, they just look too clean. So adding a little bit of noise that affects both the background, the characters or the objects, everything in your scene just makes it feel like it all hangs together a bit more authentically. Now, mostly for me, it's just adjusting the amount and the size. So you can adjust this here if you want something a bit finer. Now it doesn't need to be too crazy, like this is awful, but just something really subtle. Something between 5 and 10 is usually the sweet spot for me. As I say, very subtle, but if you're like me and you like focusing on those details, this is one of those little things that's really important. And again, if we click OK, we now have this listed as a smart filter. We can turn it off, turn it back on, or delete it altogether. Okay, so this is the last one. This is my absolute favorite technique. This is something I learned a while ago and I've started using again more recently to just give my creative compositing work a little bit of a twist. And this technique is all about digital painting. Now, I'm not the best person at drawing or painting for that matter. It's been far too long, but I can use Photoshop and I like creating work that looks like a painting. So if you think that sounds cool, I'm going to show you how to create this effect. So first of all, we'll just duplicate this layer in case anything goes wrong. Let's right click, convert to smart object, That will compress it down, and then we can just rasterize this. And what I'm going to do is add a new layer, and we'll call this painting. There we go. Now for this, I'm going to go over here, left click and hold on the brush tool and select the mixer brush tool. Now this tool deserves its own tutorial in itself, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to speed through this really quickly. So I'm going to use the same soft round pressure opacity brush, something not too big, not too small. Now here we've got a couple of options. This one on the left loads the brush after each stroke. We want this turned off. And the one on the right over here, this cleans the brush after every stroke. So that's one we want on. Again, we've got presets here. I'm going to go with moist, but you can tinker with these and then fine tune all of those different settings here. But what is important is that we make sure that sample all layers is selected. Next, we can go down to our final image and we'll drop the opacity down somewhere between 60 and 80%. So let's go for 70. And I'm going to go back onto my painting layer, make sure my mixing brush is selected. Mixing brush? Mixer brush is selected. Zoom in like so. And I'm just going to start painting. Now, this is much more effective with a graphics tablet because you can control pen pressure, which in turn controls how painted your brush strokes look. So if I go over the same area again, you can see it becomes much more painted. So it's not impossible with a mouse, but it's much easier with a graphics tablet. And you want to follow the contours of your subject's face, or if you have an object or a cube, follow those edges and brush in the right direction. If you just do this, it's going to look awful. And this does take practice. So as I say, it's not impossible with a mouse, but with a tablet, you just get a little bit more control. So I'm going to do this super quickly, and you can see I'm making lots of little mistakes here. However, I will show you a completed version in a minute and what it looks like if you just spend a bit more time on it. So you can see I'm just brushing this through. And if I'm going over areas, it's just going to make it look a bit more painted. If you do have any experience with painting, then this is probably going to come in handy. But to be honest, I don't. I haven't painted since school, not really. And even then I wasn't particularly good. And this is quite good for hair as well. You can kind of get some really nice kind of flicks. Let's just do a little bit more. I'm just speeding through this super quick. So don't judge me too harshly. We'll undo that because that was awful. Let's do the eye, there we go. And actually what I would normally do if I was doing this properly is I would make the brush a lot smaller. And you can see here, this is where I'm rushing it. The chin doesn't look particularly great. But the point is that you can turn this off now, and this is all on its own separate layer. So I think I did a better job down here. And then I can turn that back on and it will continue sampling those layers, and then you can blend these in. So let's just try and correct some of these areas where you can see the brush repeating by just going over. There we go. And this technique can be pretty quick, but the longer you spend on it, it's just going to make your end result look much better. And as I say, you turn this off and there you go. You are left with your painting. Now, if you're not convinced, that's fair. I did this pretty quickly, but here is an example of where we were before. And here is an example of how this can look if you spend a bit longer on it and give it a little bit more love and attention. So there you go. Pretty cool, right? So if you're like me and you're a non-painter, but you can use Photoshop, there you go. You can build off of the creative work you've done already and then just turn it into a painting. And in the upcoming MSI tutorials that are part of this mini-series, we're also going to look at creating graphics in Illustrator, designing a game menu UI in Adobe XD, and then wrapping everything up with some visual effects in Premiere Pro. So there we go, 8 techniques that you can use when creatively compositing images together in Photoshop. And I'll link the Creator 17 in the video description if you would like to check it out. And if you like design but gaming is more your thing, then MSI also do the GS66 and the GE66. So a huge thank you to you for watching, and a huge thank you to MSI for sponsoring this video. As always, you can drop any questions or comments down below. But like this video if you did enjoy it. Take care, and I'll see you next time.